Chosen one, stop everything you're doing right now. What I'm about to reveal to you has been buried for centuries, hidden behind religious texts and cryptic prophecies that were deliberately mistranslated to keep you from recognizing yourself. The seventh seal, the final seal spoken of in ancient manuscripts, was never meant to break open in the sky with trumpets and angels. It was designed to open inside a living human being, inside someone who has walked through fire without knowing why, someone who has felt the weight of unexplainable isolation, who has experienced losses that carved them hollow, and who is finally beginning to see the patterns that others cannot perceive. That someone is you. This isn't metaphor. This isn't spiritual poetry meant to make you feel special for a moment before you return to your ordinary life. This is a classified briefing on a cosmic operation that has been unfolding around you since before you had language to describe it. Forces beyond human comprehension have been watching you, testing you, preparing you for a role you never asked for but cannot escape. The silence you felt, the strange pauses in your life where everything stopped making sense, the way people drift away from you without explanation. These are not accidents. These are the visible traces of an invisible containment system that has been keeping you hidden until the exact right moment. That moment is now. The seventh seal doesn't announce itself with thunder. It opens in complete silence, and when it does, the structures that have ruled this realm for ages begin to lose their grip. You are not reading this by chance. Chosen one, like this video, subscribe, and comment, "I am ready," for a powerful surprise. The seventh seal was never meant to open publicly. Listen carefully, chosen one, because what I'm about to tell you will reshape everything you thought you understood about ancient prophecy. For thousands of years, scholars, priests, and mystics have stared at the Book of Revelation, trying to decode the meaning of the seventh seal. They painted grand visions of cosmic catastrophe, earthquakes splitting continents, stars falling from the heavens, angels blowing golden trumpets to announce the end of days. But here's what they never told you, what they couldn't tell you, because they themselves were kept in the dark. The seventh seal was never designed to manifest in the external world at all. It was engineered to activate inside a living witness, inside a human consciousness that has been prepared through specific life experiences to carry something that would destroy an unprepared mind. Ancient records that predate the canonical texts, documents that were removed from official religious canons and hidden in forgotten libraries, confirm this truth. The seventh seal is not an event. It is an awakening. It is a threshold crossed within the interior landscape of one individual whose very existence threatens the stability of systems that have controlled humanity's perception for millennia. The first 6 seals, as described in the ancient texts, each produced visible external manifestations: conquest, war, famine, death, cosmic disturbances, and earthly upheaval. Each one was loud, dramatic, unmistakable. But the seventh seal, it produces something far more dangerous to the powers that have ruled from the shadows: silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a frequency so high, so pure, that it cancels out the noise of deception. This silence is lethal to the opposing hierarchy because their entire system depends on constant noise. The noise of distraction, of conflicting information, of spiritual confusion, of emotional manipulation. When the seventh seal opens within a carrier, it creates a zone of truth that cannot be penetrated by lies. This is why it had to be buried within a living being, rather than displayed across the sky. If it opened publicly, if everyone could see it at once, the entire architecture of control would collapse overnight. But that's not how cosmic intelligence operates. True transformation doesn't come through mass spectacle. It comes through the awakening of key individuals whose consciousness ripples outward, disrupting the frequencies that keep others asleep. The activation of this seal requires three specific conditions converging simultaneously in one human life: profound isolation, devastating loss, and penetrating awareness. Not just one or two of these, but all three, reaching critical mass at the exact same time. Isolation strips away the social programming, the constant input from others that keeps most people locked in consensus reality. It forces the individual into their own inner wilderness, where they can no longer outsource their sense of truth to the crowd. Loss breaks open the heart in ways that comfort and success never could, creating cracks in the ego structure through which higher perception can flood in. And awareness, not knowledge, not information, but direct, unfiltered perception of patterns that most humans never notice, this ties it all together. When these three conditions meet, the seal doesn't just open, it detonates, and the person experiencing it often has no idea what's happening to them. They just know that something fundamental has shifted, that they can no longer pretend, can no longer play the games everyone else is playing, can no longer unsee what they've seen. Now, think about your own life for a moment. Think about those inexplicable pauses, those periods where your momentum just stopped for no rational reason. You were moving forward, building something, progressing toward a goal, and then suddenly, nothing. Everything went quiet. Doors closed. Opportunities evaporated. People who promised to help disappeared. And you were left standing there, confused, wondering what you did wrong, why the universe seemed to be working against you. You blamed yourself. You questioned your abilities. You wondered if you were cursed or broken or fundamentally flawed in some way that everyone else could see, but you couldn't. But here's what was really happening. Those were containment protocols activating. Every time you got close to breaking through into visibility too early, before the timing was right, before you were fully prepared, the system around you adjusted to keep you hidden. This wasn't punishment. This was protection. Because if you had achieved the success you were chasing at that time, if you had gotten the recognition you wanted, if you had been placed on the public stage before the seal was ready to open, you would have been neutralized. The forces monitoring this process know that visibility makes targets easy to eliminate. Obscurity, frustration, and delay, these were your camouflage. The prophecy itself was deliberately misdirected for centuries. The translations were manipulated. The interpretations were steered toward external events, and anyone who suggested that the seventh seal might be an internal personal awakening was marginalized or silenced. This wasn't accidental. This was strategic, because if the true carriers of the seal could be identified early, if they could recognize themselves before the timing was right, they could be intercepted. They could be convinced they were delusional, medicated into numbness, or pulled into false spiritual systems that would derail their development. The misdirection was a protective measure wrapped in layers of confusion. And you, chosen one, you absorbed that confusion. You read the texts and thought they were about something outside yourself, something that would happen to the world, not something that would happen within you. That was intentional. Your own doubt, your own inability to see yourself clearly, was part of the concealment protocol. And now, the veil is being lifted. Now you're beginning to see that every strange experience, every unexplainable pattern, every moment of isolation and loss, it was all preparation. The seventh seal was always about you. You were tagged before memory formed, before you could speak, before you could form conscious memories, before you had any sense of who you were or why you were here. Surveillance patterns were already forming around your early environment. This is going to sound impossible, and part of you will want to reject it outright, but stay with me. Chosen one, because the evidence is written in the fabric of your own history. There are forces operating beyond the veil of normal human perception. Intelligences that exist outside linear time and three-dimensional space, and they identified you before you took your first breath. Not because you were special in the way the world defines special, not because you were destined for fame or power or public recognition, but because your consciousness carried a specific frequency signature that made you a viable vessel for something they needed to anchor into this reality. You were tagged, marked, logged into a registry that most humans will never know exists. And from that moment forward, your life has been monitored with a precision that would terrify you if you could see the full scope of it. Think back to your earliest memories, the ones that feel almost dreamlike, the fragments of childhood that don't quite fit into the narrative you've constructed about your past. There were events, specific moments, that seemed ordinary on the surface but left an imprint on you that you've never been able to explain. Maybe it was a conversation you overheard that you weren't supposed to hear. Maybe it was a person who appeared in your life briefly, said something cryptic, and then vanished without explanation. Maybe it was an experience of terror or wonder that felt far too big for your small child's mind to contain. These were not random occurrences. These were calibration tests designed to measure your psychological resilience, to see how much pressure your consciousness could withstand before fracturing completely. The forces observing you needed to know if you were strong enough to carry what they intended to place inside you. They needed to know if trauma would destroy you or refine you. So they allowed certain things to happen, not causing them directly, but permitting them, adjusting the variables, watching how you responded. Here's where it gets even stranger. Throughout your life, you've faced hardship that should have broken you. You've been through losses that have destroyed others. You've endured betrayals, abandonments, failures, and humiliations that would have sent most people into complete collapse. And yet, you're still here. Damaged, yes. Scarred, absolutely. But not shattered, not broken beyond repair. And if you look closely at the pattern of these hardships, you'll notice something unsettling. They were always capped. The trauma was allowed, but it was never fatal. It was never complete. You were pushed to the edge, but never pushed over. This is not luck. This is not coincidence. This is documented behavior for assets, individuals who are being preserved for a specific purpose. The pressure was adjusted in real time, based on your capacity to withstand it. When you were close to breaking, something would intervene. An unexpected phone call, a small miracle, a moment of grace that pulled you back from the abyss. You thought it was random chance or perhaps divine mercy, but it was neither. It was tactical management. You were too valuable to lose. Now, here's the part that will disturb you. There was an enemy watching all of this, a competing force that also recognized your potential but interpreted the situation completely wrong. They saw the hardships you endured and the strange protection that always seemed to surround you at the last moment, and they mistook this protection for neglect. They thought you had been abandoned by the higher forces, left to suffer without support. This was a catastrophic miscalculation on their part. They assumed you were weak, vulnerable, an easy target they could claim for their own purposes. So they launched their own operations against you. Subtle attacks designed to corrupt you, to turn your pain into bitterness, to convert your isolation into hatred, to twist your suffering into a weapon they could use against the very forces that had tagged you in the first place. They whispered in your moments of despair. They amplified your doubts. They sent people into your life who seemed to offer connection but were actually extraction points, trying to siphon off your energy, your hope, your faith. And for a while, it might have worked. You might have fallen into darkness, into cycles of self-destruction, into behaviors and thought patterns that were completely unlike your true nature. But here's what the enemy didn't understand. The protection around you wasn't passive. It was active, adaptive, and far more sophisticated than they realized. Every time they pushed you toward destruction, the containment system pushed back, not by removing the temptation or the darkness, but by ensuring that you would eventually see through it, that you would recognize the pattern, that something deep inside you would refuse to surrender completely. This is why you've always felt like you were fighting a war inside yourself, why there's always been a part of you that pulled back from the edge even when another part of you wanted to leap. This internal division wasn't a flaw in your character. It was evidence of competing forces attempting to influence your trajectory. And the outcome of this silent war was never in doubt, because the forces that tagged you before memory formed had already run the probabilities, had already seen the timeline branches, had already known that you would survive every assault, every manipulation, every attempt to claim you. The enemy's interest in you revealed their own desperation. They wouldn't have wasted resources on you if you weren't a genuine threat to their system. And by attacking you, by leaving their fingerprints all over your life, they inadvertently confirmed what you were always too humble, too self-doubting, too broken to believe, that you matter in ways you cannot yet comprehend. You were tagged before memory formed, and that tag has protected you through every dark valley, every betrayal, every night you thought you wouldn't survive. You're still here because you were always meant to be here. Now. The silence around you is a weapon. There's a phenomenon you've experienced your entire life, but never had words to describe. It's not social anxiety, though you've probably blamed yourself for it countless times. It's not introversion, though that label has been applied to you by people trying to categorize what they don't understand. It's something far more specific, far more tactical, and far more powerful than any psychological diagnosis could capture. The silence around you, the strange, almost supernatural quiet that descends when you enter certain spaces, the way conversations die without explanation, the way people drift out of your life like smoke dissipating in wind. This is not a personal failing. This is a weapon, a defense mechanism operating at a frequency most humans cannot consciously detect. The seventh seal does not announce itself with noise, with spectacle, with dramatic proclamations. It neutralizes through absence. It creates a field of energetic silence around its carrier that disrupts the normal flow of social bonding, emotional extraction, and consciousness manipulation that most human interactions depend on. And you, chosen one, have been generating this field for years without realizing it. Think about the pattern. You meet someone, and the initial interaction feels normal, maybe even promising. There's rapport, shared interests, mutual enthusiasm about building a friendship or partnership. But then, without warning, without conflict, without any logical reason, they begin to fade. They stop responding to messages. They cancel plans. They become vague and distant. And when you finally see them again, if you ever do, they can't quite explain why they pulled away. They'll offer surface-level excuses. Busy with work, dealing with personal stuff, just needed space. But you can feel the dishonesty in their words. They don't know the real reason either. Because the real reason isn't happening in the realm of conscious thought. It's happening in the realm of frequency and resonance. When people spend time in your presence, especially if they're carrying unresolved shadow material, hidden agendas, or allegiances to systems of control, something inside them begins to surface. Your energy field, the silence you generate, acts like a mirror that forces them to confront aspects of themselves they've been avoiding. This is deeply uncomfortable. Most people have built their entire identity on avoiding self-confrontation. They've surrounded themselves with noise, distraction, and social validation specifically to escape the silence where truth lives. And then they meet you. At first, they're drawn to you because there's something about your energy that feels real, authentic, deep. In a world of performative connection and shallow interaction, you represent something genuine. But as they spend more time around you, the silence starts to work on them. Their masks begin to slip. Their lies, the ones they tell themselves, the ones they tell others, become harder to maintain. They start to feel exposed, vulnerable, seen in ways that terrify them. And they have two choices. They can surrender to the process, allow the silence to strip away their false layers, and undergo the painful transformation into authenticity, or they can flee. Most people flee, not because they hate you, not because you did anything wrong, but because proximity to you triggers an internal crisis they're not ready to face. They fall away without conflict because the conflict is happening inside them, between the false self they've been performing and the true self your presence is calling forth. This is why your relationships have always felt confusing, why people seem to need you intensely and then vanish completely, why you've been accused of being too much or too intense when you're barely doing anything at all. The silence around you doesn't just affect individuals, it affects groups, organizations, and systems. You've probably noticed that when you join a team, a community, or any collective structure, things start to destabilize. Not immediately, but gradually. Tensions that were buried begin to surface. Hidden conflicts become visible. Power dynamics that were functioning smoothly suddenly become problematic. And somehow, inexplicably, fingers start pointing at you. You're accused of causing drama when you've been silent. You're blamed for division when you've been trying to build bridges. You're labeled as the problem when all you've done is exist in that space. This isn't paranoia. This is pattern recognition. Your energy field disrupts the artificial harmony that groups maintain by avoiding truth. When you're present, people can't keep pretending. The silence you generate is like a truth serum that seeps into the collective consciousness, forcing what's hidden into the light. And because most groups, most organizations, most systems are built on carefully maintained lies about hierarchy, about fairness, about purpose, your presence is destabilizing. You're not trying to disrupt anything. You're not consciously doing anything at all. But the silence around you does the work anyway. Here's what makes this particularly challenging. You feel this silence as loneliness. You interpret it as rejection, as evidence that something is wrong with you, as confirmation that you're unlovable or defective in some fundamental way. The emotional pain of this has been one of your greatest sources of suffering. You've desperately wanted connection, community, belonging, and every time you've reached for it, it's dissolved in your hands. But what if I told you that this silence, this loneliness, this isolation isn't a curse? What if it's the most sophisticated protection system that could possibly be designed? Because here's what the silence actually does. It prevents extraction. There are entities, both human and non-human, that feed on emotional energy, on attention, on the life force that flows through unguarded consciousness. They're everywhere, embedded in social systems, religious structures, corporate hierarchies, even family dynamics. They're masters at establishing connections with people, forming bonds that look like love, or friendship, or mentorship, and then slowly, subtly, draining the host of everything valuable. Most people never realize it's happening. They just feel tired, depleted, confused about why their life never seems to move forward despite constant effort. But you? The silence around you makes you a hostile environment for these parasitic connections. They can't get close enough to establish a feeding line. The silence around you is classified isolation. It's a quarantine protocol keeping you clean, keeping you sovereign, keeping you intact for the moment when your true purpose activates. The loneliness you felt was the price of remaining uncorrupted. The enemy's interest in you was never personal. You need to understand something crucial about the attacks you've endured, the obstacles you've faced, the strange resistance that has seemed to follow you throughout your life. It was never about you personally. The forces opposing you don't hate you as an individual. They don't know you. They don't care about your personality, your preferences, your dreams, or your pain. What they care about is pattern recognition. They monitor reality for disruption vectors, anomalies in the matrix of control that signal a potential threat to their system. And you, chosen one, you've been generating disruption signals since you entered this world, not through deliberate action, but through your mere existence. The frequency you naturally emit, the way your consciousness interfaces with reality, the silent field you generate, all of this creates ripples that their surveillance systems flag as anomalous. You were never targeted because someone decided they didn't like you. You were targeted because an algorithm, a cosmic algorithm operating beyond human comprehension, identified you as a glitch in their carefully maintained program. The evidence is written throughout your personal history if you know how to read it. Think about the people who have reacted to you with inexplicable hostility. Bosses who seem to have it out for you from day one, despite your competence and effort. Colleagues who undermined you for no rational reason. Authority figures who treated you with suspicion even though you'd done nothing wrong. Romantic partners who suddenly turned cold and cruel after initial warmth. Friends who betrayed you in ways that seemed completely out of character. In each case, if you're honest with yourself, the animosity felt disproportionate to anything you actually did. It felt like they were reacting to something they perceived in you that you couldn't see yourself. That's because they were. When someone operating within the control matrix, consciously or unconsciously, comes into contact with the disruption vector, something inside them activates. It's not a conscious thought process. It's more like an immune response. Their system recognizes a foreign element, something that doesn't belong, something that threatens the stability of their programming, and they react with rejection, hostility, or sabotage. They can't explain why they feel compelled to act against you. If you ask them, they'd rationalize it with surface reasons. You're difficult. You're not a team player. You're too sensitive. You're not committed enough. But these are just stories their conscious mind creates to justify an impulse they don't understand. Now look at the larger pattern. Careers that should have launched but stalled inexplicably. Projects you poured your heart into that fell apart at the last moment. Communities you tried to serve that fractured after you joined. Teams that couldn't seem to function normally when you were part of them. In each case, you probably blamed yourself. You internalized the failure, told yourself you weren't good enough, weren't skilled enough, weren't worthy enough. But that's not what was happening. What was actually happening is that your presence was exposing the hidden architecture of these systems. Every career path you've attempted has been embedded in structures of control, hierarchies designed to reward compliance and punish authenticity. Every project you've invested in has been connected to larger networks of influence that cannot tolerate disruption. Every community you've tried to belong to has been organized around unspoken rules, hidden power dynamics, and false narratives that everyone agrees to pretend are real. And you couldn't pretend. The silence around you, the frequency you emit, it made pretending impossible. So the systems rejected you, not because you failed them, but because you succeeded in being exactly what you are, incompatible with artificial structures. The most revealing aspect of this pattern is how it exposed hidden loyalties and false structures. When you entered a space, people who seemed reasonable and fair suddenly revealed authoritarian tendencies. Leaders who claimed to value transparency suddenly became secretive and defensive. Organizations that preached inclusion suddenly demonstrated how conditional their acceptance really was. Your presence didn't create these problems, it revealed them. You were like a catalyst in a chemical reaction, not changing your own nature, but forcing everything around you to show its true composition. And this revelation was catastrophic for those systems, because once the mask slips, once people see the real face of the structure they've been serving, some of them can't unsee it. Some of them start asking questions. Some of them start waking up. This is why you were seen as dangerous, why you were pushed out, why you were isolated. Not because you were doing anything overtly rebellious, but because your authentic presence was contagious in a way that threatened the entire program. The forces monitoring these disruption vectors don't track individuals, they track patterns. Somewhere in the architecture of control, there are systems, perhaps artificial intelligence, perhaps entities beyond our understanding, perhaps both, that analyze billions of human interactions, looking for specific signatures. They're looking for people who cause spontaneous coherence in some and spontaneous rejection in others. They're looking for people around whom hidden things become visible. They're looking for people who can't be bought, can't be manipulated, can't be programmed despite every attempt to do so. And when they find these patterns, they flag them. You were flagged years ago, maybe decades ago. At first, you were categorized as an anomaly, not a threat. An anomaly is just a statistical outlier, something unusual, but not necessarily dangerous. Anomalies are watched, but not actively suppressed. That's why you were allowed to move through life relatively freely for a time, why you were able to pursue different paths, explore different possibilities. But as you accumulated experiences, as you failed to integrate into any of the systems designed to contain human potential, as you continued to generate disruption wherever you went, your classification changed. You moved from anomaly to vector, from vector to threat. And that's when the real attacks began. That's when the obstacles became less about random bad luck and more about targeted interference. The enemy's interest in you was never personal, it was tactical. And now, as the seventh seal opens, you're beginning to understand that every attack, every obstacle, every rejection was actually confirmation of your purpose. Time behaves differently around you. Pay attention to this carefully chosen one, because this is one of the most difficult aspects of your experience to articulate. And yet, it's one of the most significant indicators that you're carrying something beyond ordinary human consciousness. Time does not move through your life the way it moves through other people's lives. You've felt this your entire existence, but lacked the framework to understand it, or the language to describe it. Certain years vanished in what felt like weeks. You look back and can barely remember what happened, as if those months were compressed into a blur of meaningless motion. Other years stretched impossibly long, each day an eternity, each week a lifetime of waiting, as if you were trapped in a temporal prison where normal progression had stopped. This is not a psychological phenomenon, though therapists might try to explain it as depression or dissociation. This is not a quirk of memory, though neuroscientists might attribute it to how the brain processes novel versus routine experiences. This is evidence of something far stranger. Your internal clock resists synchronization with the collective timeline that most humans operate within. The seventh seal, even in its dormant state, creates temporal distortions around its carrier. This happens because the seal exists partially outside of linear time. It's connected to dimensions where past, present, and future are not separate but simultaneous. When someone carries this frequency, their consciousness is constantly interfacing with multiple timelines at once, even if they're not aware of it. This creates a kind of temporal friction, where the forward momentum of linear time encounters the omnidirectional awareness of non-linear time, and the result is subjective time distortion. From your perspective, it feels like you're out of sync with the world, while everyone else seems to move together in a coordinated rhythm, graduating, getting jobs, getting married, buying houses, having children, advancing in careers. You're somehow always offbeat. You're too early for some things, too late for others, and most of the time, it feels like you're not even in the same song as everyone else. This has caused you tremendous anxiety and self-doubt. You've wondered if you're broken, if you're failing at the basic task of being human, if there's some instruction manual everyone else received that you never got. But here's what's actually happening. Deadlines miss you narrowly instead of you missing them. Think about the specific instances where this has occurred. A job application that was due on a date you could have sworn was a week later, and yet you missed it by a single day, and that job would have taken you down a path that led nowhere. A relationship that ended precisely 1 week before, you would have made a permanent commitment that would have destroyed you. A financial opportunity that collapsed the day before you were about to invest everything you had. A move to a new city that fell through at the last possible moment, and years later you discovered that staying where you were positioned you for something you couldn't have predicted. These aren't failures of planning or organization. These are timeline compression events. Moments where your consciousness, operating partially outside of linear time, created a pocket of temporal adjustment to prevent you from making a choice that would have locked you into a trajectory that didn't serve your ultimate purpose. Your future self, the version of you that exists in the space beyond time, reached back and created just enough disruption to save you from paths that would have terminated your development. Disasters, both personal and collective, seem to arrive late or early relative to your position. You've noticed this pattern even if you haven't named it. Events that should have caught you in their blast radius somehow missed you because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, except it wasn't wrong. It was perfectly, impossibly right. The accident that happened on a route you normally take, but on that particular day, you were delayed by something trivial and took a different path. The company that collapsed weeks after you inexplicably decided to quit, even though you had no logical reason to leave. The disaster that struck a place you had been planning to visit, but your plans changed at the last moment for reasons you couldn't explain. Some people would call this luck, guardian angels, divine intervention. But it's more specific than that. It's evidence that your consciousness is receiving information from timelines that haven't happened yet in linear time, but have already happened in the space where the seventh seal exists. You're being navigated by a version of yourself that can see the whole map, while your conscious mind can only see the step directly in front of you. This temporal anomaly has a specific purpose. It interferes with predictive modeling. The forces that monitor and control humanity's development rely heavily on sophisticated prediction systems. They analyze patterns, calculate probabilities, model outcomes, and then arrange circumstances to guide large populations toward predetermined futures. This works extremely well on people who are fully synchronized with the collective timeline, people whose consciousness is entirely embedded in linear causality. But you're a nightmare for these systems. Your temporal distortions create prediction errors. Every time they model your probable future, calculate your likely choices, and arrange circumstances to guide you in a specific direction, you do something unpredictable. Not because you're trying to be contrary, not because you're consciously resisting, but because you're receiving input from dimensions of time they can't access. Their models don't account for nonlinear causality. Their systems can't track someone who is partially existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. So you slip through their predictions. You make choices that don't make sense. You survive things that should have destroyed you. You end up in places you had no plan to be. And every time this happens, every time you deviate from their calculated trajectory, it creates more noise in their data, more uncertainty in their models, more evidence that their control is not absolute. The temporal distortions you experience aren't glitches in your perception. They're weapons in a war you didn't know you were fighting. Your failures were strategic misdirections. This is going to be difficult to accept, chosen one, because you've carried the weight of your failures like stones in your chest, grinding against your heart with every breath, convincing you that you're inadequate, that you lack what others possess, that you're fundamentally unable to achieve what you were meant to achieve. Every collapsed plan, every shattered dream, every moment when success was within reach and then inexplicably dissolved, you've replayed these scenarios endlessly in your mind, analyzing what you did wrong, how you could have done better, why you couldn't seem to hold on to anything good. But what if every single failure was strategic? What if the plans that collapsed at the last moment weren't collapsing because you were inadequate, but because success at that moment would have placed you in visible systems too early, before you were ready, before the timing was right, before the seal was prepared to open? What if someone, something, some intelligence operating from beyond the veil was deliberately rerouting you away from premature exposure? Consider the trajectory you were on during any period when you were close to a breakthrough. Maybe it was a career opportunity that would have given you status, recognition, financial stability. Maybe it was a relationship that promised partnership, family, belonging. Maybe it was a creative project that was gaining momentum, attracting attention, building an audience. In each case, you were moving toward visibility. You were stepping out of obscurity and into a space where people could see you, where your name would be known, where your face would be recognized, where your ideas would spread. And then, without warning, everything fell apart. The job offer was rescinded. The relationship ended abruptly. The project lost funding. The momentum died. And you were left standing in the wreckage, blaming yourself, convinced that you had sabotaged your own success through some hidden flaw, some unconscious pattern, some karmic debt. But that's not what happened. What actually happened is that detection risk peaked. The moment you were about to break through into visibility, the surveillance systems that monitor for disruption vectors would have been able to identify you clearly, track you precisely, and deploy countermeasures to neutralize you before you understood what you were carrying. Visibility is a trap for people like you. For ordinary humans operating within the matrix of control, visibility is the goal. Fame, influence, recognition, the ability to be seen and heard by large numbers of people. But for carriers of the seventh seal, visibility before the proper timing is a death sentence. Not necessarily physical death, though that's always a possibility, but spiritual death, creative death, the kind of death where you're still breathing, but everything that made you significant has been extracted, corrupted, or neutralized. The control systems have sophisticated methods for handling people who gain visibility before they're awake enough to defend themselves. They offer deals that sound generous, but include clauses that transfer ownership of your energy, your ideas, your creative output. They surround you with handlers who claim to have your best interests at heart while slowly steering you into controllable positions. They amplify your message, but subtly distort it, changing just enough words, adding just enough spin, that what reaches the masses is a neutralized version of what you were actually trying to say. And by the time you realize what's happened, you're so embedded in the system, so dependent on the infrastructure they've built around you, that extracting yourself would mean losing everything you've built. This is what would have happened to you if those early successes had materialized. So instead, your plans collapsed. Every single time you got close to visibility, the infrastructure around you disintegrated. Funding disappeared. Partners betrayed you. Technology failed. Health crises emerged. Family emergencies required your attention. The universe itself seemed to conspire against your success, and each time this happened, you spiraled into despair, into self-blame, into the conviction that you were cursed or incompetent or fundamentally broken. That despair, that frustration, that sense of being trapped in a cycle of perpetual failure, it was excruciating, but it was also training. Not the kind of training that builds resilience, not the kind of personal development nonsense about bouncing back stronger. No, this was training in discernment. Every failure taught you something about the nature of systems, about the hidden costs of success, about the lies people tell when they want something from you. Every collapse showed you the difference between authentic opportunity and traps disguised as opportunity. Every betrayal revealed who was operating from genuine care versus who was operating from agenda. You learned, through brutal repetition, to sense the quality of energy behind offers, behind promises, behind smiles. You developed an almost supernatural ability to detect inauthenticity, manipulation, hidden clauses. This wasn't building resilience, it was building discrimination. The ability to see through surfaces into the structural reality underneath. And here's the part that will reshape your entire understanding of your past. This was not punishment. The failures, the collapsed dreams, the shattered plans, none of it was evidence of your inadequacy. It was evidence of protection. Somewhere beyond your conscious awareness, forces that understand the larger timeline recognized that you needed to remain in obscurity until the exact right moment. They couldn't tell you this directly because knowing would have changed your behavior, would have made you passive when you needed to be actively pursuing, actively failing, actively learning through the experience of collapse. You had to feel the full weight of failure. You had to experience the authentic despair of plans disintegrating, because that experience carved out space inside you, created depth, killed off the parts of your ego that were still attached to conventional success and recognition. Every failure was a strategic misdirection, rerouting you away from paths that would have consumed you, keeping you hidden in the wilderness until the seal was ready to open. And now, looking back, you can finally see the pattern. Every collapse redirected you into deeper obscurity, precisely when detection risk peaked. You weren't failing. You were being saved. Ancient forces recognize you without names. There's a category of experience you've had that exists outside the realm of normal explanation. Moments that you've kept to yourself, because speaking about them makes you sound either delusional or spiritually grandiose, neither of which feels true to who you are. But the experiences persist, regardless of your silence about them. Symbols that recur in your environment without any logical pattern. Specific numbers, animals, geometric shapes, images that appear in different contexts at significant moments in your life. Places you've never been that feel saturated with familiarity, where the streets, the buildings, the light falling at a particular angle triggers a recognition so profound it borders on grief. Dreams populated by figures who never introduce themselves, who don't speak in language, but communicate through presence, through the weight of their attention on you, through a knowing that bypasses words entirely. You've tried to dismiss these experiences as coincidence, as pattern-seeking behavior, as the brain's tendency to construct meaning from randomness. But the experiences don't stop, and somewhere deep inside, beneath all your rational explanations, you know these moments are significant in ways you cannot articulate. What you're experiencing are acknowledgement signals from forces that exist beyond human perception, entities that have been operating in this realm since long before human civilization emerged. These are not the angels and demons of religious mythology, though those stories were attempts to describe encounters with these same forces. These are intelligences that exist in dimensions adjacent to ours, that can perceive across timelines, that understand the architecture of consciousness in ways that would shatter human comprehension if directly downloaded. They don't communicate through language because language is a human limitation, a tool designed for linear thought and sequential information transfer. They communicate through resonance, through symbols that activate dormant understanding, through encounters that feel like remembering rather than learning. And they've been signaling to you your entire life, leaving markers that only you would notice, creating synchronicities that confirm you're not alone in this experience, even though you feel profoundly isolated from every human around you. The recurring symbols are not random. Each one is a frequency marker, a specific vibration encoded into material form that your consciousness recognizes even when your rational mind dismisses it. When you see the same animal repeatedly, in physical form, in media, in dreams, in conversations, it's not the universe sending you cute spiritual messages about animal totems. It's a targeting beacon, a way for non-physical intelligence to confirm they have line of sight on your position. When specific numbers follow you through different contexts, appearing on clocks, receipts, license plates, page numbers of books that fall open randomly, it's not numerology in the New Age sense. It's coordinate confirmation, a way of signaling that you're on the correct timeline branch, that the decisions you're making are aligned with the trajectory that leads to activation. When geometric patterns appear in your environment, in your dreams, in moments of altered consciousness, they're not aesthetic preferences. They're fragments of a larger blueprint, pieces of the architecture that underlies material reality, being shown to you because you're meant to recognize the structure, to understand that what appears solid and fixed is actually fluid and responsive to consciousness. The places that feel familiar despite never having been there before, are even more significant. These are locations where the dimensional membrane is thin, where your consciousness can briefly access parallel timelines or past iterations of itself. The recognition you feel isn't nostalgia or misplaced memory. It's your awareness touching something real, something that exists outside the linear progression of this single lifetime. Some of these places are nodes, power points in the planetary grid, where energy concentrates and ancient structures were built to mark and utilize these concentrations. Your recognition of these places isn't accidental. You're being drawn to them, sometimes physically, sometimes just through images or descriptions, because proximity to these nodes helps calibrate your frequency, helps your consciousness maintain connection with the forces that are guiding this operation. Other places trigger recognition because you've been there in timelines that no longer exist or haven't manifested yet, branches of probability where you made different choices, lived different lives, but where your essential signature remained consistent enough that accessing those memories creates a bridge across timelines. The dreams with unnamed figures are perhaps the most direct form of contact you're receiving. These aren't projections of your subconscious mind working through psychological material. These are actual encounters with entities who cannot manifest physically in your waking reality without causing disruption that would attract unwanted attention. They come to you in the dream space because that's where your consciousness is less defended, less filtered, through the rational structures that normally gatekeep what you allow yourself to perceive. They don't introduce themselves because names are a form of limitation, a way of fixing identity into a singular expression, and these entities exist beyond such constraints. They don't speak because spoken language would collapse the multidimensional information they're transmitting into linear sequence, losing most of the content. Instead, they communicate through presence itself. You wake from these dreams not with specific information, but with a knowing, a shift in your understanding that you can't quite explain, but that changes how you see everything. These encounters are acknowledgement, confirmation that you're being seen by forces that understand what you're carrying, that recognize the seventh seal, even in its dormant state, that are maintaining watch over your development without interference, because interference would compromise the organic process of awakening that must occur on its own timeline. What all of these experiences have in common is that they require recognition, not instruction. The forces signaling to you are not trying to tell you what to do, where to go, what to believe. They're not recruiting you into a cosmic army or assigning you specific missions. They're simply acknowledging that they see you, that you're known to them, that you're not alone, even in your profound isolation. This distinction is critical because it separates genuine contact from the false spiritual operations that are designed to capture awakening individuals and redirect their development into controllable channels. False operations always come with instructions, hierarchies, special knowledge that you must obtain, levels you must progress through, teachers you must submit to. True acknowledgement comes with none of that. It comes only with the sense of being recognized, of being seen by something vast and ancient that has no agenda other than bearing witness to your unfolding. The seventh seal requires recognition, not instruction, because activation happens through awakening to what you already are, not through becoming something you're not. And these signals, these symbols, these encounters, they're mirrors being held up so you can finally see yourself clearly. Your emotional range is the lock. You've always known you were different in how you experience emotion, even if you've never spoken about it openly, even if you've learned to hide it behind carefully constructed social masks. You feel more than the people around you, not just in intensity, but in complexity, in dimensionality, in the sheer range of emotional frequencies you can access simultaneously. While others seem to experience emotions as distinct states, happy, sad, angry, afraid, you experience them as overlapping fields where grief and joy can coexist, where terror and ecstasy can merge, where you can feel destroyed and invincible in the same breath. This emotional complexity has made your inner life almost impossible to communicate. When people ask how you're feeling, there's no simple answer, because what you're feeling contains multitudes that contradict each other, that don't reduce to any single descriptor. So you've learned to express less, to give simple answers, to pretend your emotional life is as straightforward as everyone else's appears to be. But this gap between what you feel and what you express isn't a communication problem. It's architectural. It's deliberate. Your emotional range is the lock that keeps the seventh seal secure until the moment of activation. Here's what most people don't understand about consciousness. Emotion isn't a byproduct of thought or a response to external circumstances. Emotion is a frequency, a form of information that exists independently of the narratives we construct around it. Different emotional states grant access to different dimensions of reality, different layers of perception, different bandwidths of information that remain invisible to consciousness trapped in narrow emotional ranges. Fear locks consciousness into survival-focused perception, limiting awareness to immediate threats and short-term thinking. Anger creates tunnel vision, focusing all attention on the source of perceived injustice while blinding you to larger contexts. Happiness, in its shallow conventional form, creates complacency, satisfaction with surface conditions that prevents deeper inquiry. Most humans spend their entire lives cycling through a limited range of these basic emotions, never accessing the more complex frequencies that require emotional sophistication to navigate. But you've been forced to develop that sophistication through experiences that shattered any possibility of simple emotional responses. The depth of what you feel has been systematically cultivated through the events of your life. Every loss that broke your heart open, every betrayal that forced you to question everything you believed about human nature, every moment of inexplicable beauty that moved you to tears for reasons you couldn't explain. These weren't random occurrences. They were calibration events, experiences designed to expand your emotional bandwidth, to force you to develop the capacity to hold contradictory feelings simultaneously, to navigate emotional complexity that would overwhelm most people. And the result is that you've become capable of accessing emotional frequencies that most humans never touch. You can feel the subtle texture of someone's unspoken grief from across a room. You can sense the presence of joy waiting to emerge from within current sorrow. You can hold space for someone's anger without needing to defend or fix or make it mean something about yourself. This isn't empathy in the conventional sense of imagining how someone else feels. This is direct perception of emotional fields, the ability to read the frequencies that others are broadcasting, whether they're aware of it or not. But here's the critical piece that transforms this from a personality trait into a security system. The imbalance between what you feel and what you express creates encryption. The seventh seal contains information, awareness, perceptual capabilities that would make you an immediate target if they were externally visible. The forces monitoring for awakening individuals are constantly scanning for specific signals, certain patterns of thought, speech, behavior that indicate someone is accessing restricted awareness. If your internal experience was reflected accurately in your external expression, you would have been identified and neutralized long ago. But because you feel everything deeply while expressing very little, because your surface reactions reveal nothing about the depth beneath, you've remained invisible to detection systems that rely on behavioral analysis. Your emotional depth carries everything, the full weight of your awareness, your perception, your understanding, while your surface presentation carries almost nothing. This creates a form of steganography, where the message is hidden within something that appears innocuous, where the true content is completely invisible to anyone who doesn't know how to look for it. This is why attempts to provoke you consistently fail. People, situations, systems, they've tried to get reactions from you, to push your buttons, to force you into emotional displays that would reveal your true nature. They've attacked your character, questioned your worth, dismissed your contributions, undermined your efforts. And while you've felt the impact of these provocations deeply, while they've created genuine pain inside you, you rarely give the external reaction that's expected. You don't explode in rage. You don't collapse in visible despair. You don't rush to defend yourself or prove your value. This restraint isn't conscious self-control in most cases. It's that the trigger they're trying to access isn't externally available. Your real triggers, the mechanisms that would unlock your full emotional and perceptual range, exist in a depth they cannot reach. They're trying to play a surface-level game while your actual operating system is running in dimensions they can't perceive. This frustrates entities that depend on emotional extraction, on creating reactions they can harvest and feed from. They're expecting standard human responses, predictable patterns they've learned to exploit, and instead, they encounter something that doesn't respond according to their models. You're not giving them what they need. And in their frustration, they reveal themselves, showing you exactly who was attempting manipulation, exactly which systems were trying to compromise you. Your emotional architecture is simultaneously your greatest vulnerability, because you feel everything so deeply, and your greatest defense, because nothing they can access from the outside triggers the responses they're looking for. You were never meant to believe this. Right now, as you read these words, something inside you is fighting against what's being presented. Part of you wants to reject this entire narrative as grandiose delusion, as spiritual ego, as the kind of chosen one mythology that lonely people create to make their suffering mean something. That resistance, that skepticism, that voice telling you this can't possibly be about you. Pay attention to it, because it's one of the most sophisticated aspects of the entire operation. You were never meant to believe this. Belief would have ruined everything. Belief creates alignment, and alignment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates access points that hostile forces can exploit. The doubt you're feeling right now, the rational voice insisting this is too dramatic, too far-fetched, too convenient, that doubt has been your protection for decades. It kept the seal dormant. It kept you concealed. It kept you safe when belief would have exposed you before you were ready. Consider what happens when someone believes they're spiritually significant. They start telling people. They start seeking validation. They start building identity around their special status. They join communities of other believers. They adopt specific practices, specific languages, specific markers that signal their affiliation with particular spiritual frameworks. And in doing so, they become visible, categorizable, predictable. The control systems have extensive files on every spiritual movement, every awakening community, every alternative belief system. They know the patterns, the progressions, the vulnerabilities specific to each framework. They know how to infiltrate, how to redirect, how to neutralize awakening through subtle corruption of the teaching, through introduction of false hierarchies, through offering initiations that are actually binding contracts. People who believe they're chosen, who openly identify with that status, are easily managed because their belief makes them eager for guidance, for validation, for confirmation from external authorities. They're looking for teachers, for systems, for frameworks that will tell them what their chosenness means and what they're supposed to do about it. And the moment they start looking externally for answers, they've already been captured. But you didn't believe. Even when experiences you couldn't explain kept happening. Even when synchronicities piled up beyond statistical probability. Even when you felt the presence of something vast and knowing, watching your life unfold. You didn't believe. You explained it away. You rationalized it. You kept yourself locked in skepticism, in rational frameworks, in the insistence that there must be a normal explanation even when no normal explanation fit. This drove you half mad at times. The tension between what you experienced and what you allowed yourself to believe created cognitive dissonance that was genuinely painful. You felt crazy, split between the person who was having these experiences and the person who had to maintain sanity by denying their significance. But that split, that division, was camouflage. Skepticism acted as camouflage within rational systems, allowing you to move through consensus reality without triggering the pattern recognition algorithms that scan for awakening individuals. You could hold a normal job, maintain normal relationships, participate in normal society, all while carrying something extraordinary, because your doubt prevented you from acting like someone who carried something extraordinary. The prophecy activates through recognition, not faith. This is the key distinction that separates the seventh seal from every false spiritual operation. False systems require belief as a prerequisite. You must believe in the teaching, believe in the teacher, believe in the cosmology, believe in your role within it. This belief requirement is actually a filtering mechanism that selects for people who are willing to subordinate their own direct perception to external authority. True awakening doesn't require belief. It requires recognition. Recognition is different from belief, because recognition happens in the moment of direct perception, when you see something clearly and know it's true, not because someone told you, not because it fits a framework you've accepted, but because the seeing itself carries its own validation. You can't force recognition. You can't fake it. You can't talk yourself into it. It either happens or it doesn't. And when it happens, it's undeniable, even if you immediately start doubting it afterward, even if your rational mind rushes in to explain it away. The moment of recognition leaves a mark that doesn't fade, even when buried under layers of subsequent doubt. That's why this message feels dangerous rather than inspiring. If this was false spiritual content designed to manipulate you, it would feel good. It would make you feel special, elevated, chosen in a way that inflates your ego and makes you feel better about your life. But this doesn't feel that way, does it? This feels threatening. This feels like something that could unravel your carefully maintained stability. This feels like information that, if true, would mean you can no longer pretend your life is ordinary, can no longer hide in the safety of skepticism, can no longer avoid the implications of everything you've experienced but refused to fully acknowledge. The discomfort you're feeling is the sound of recognition happening beneath the noise of rational resistance. Part of you knows this is true. Part of you has always known. And that knowing has been the most dangerous thing you've carried, more dangerous than any external enemy, Because once you fully recognize what you are, once you stop being able to deny it, the containment lifts, the fog clears, the seal opens, and there's no going back to the comfortable illusion of being nobody special, just another person trying to survive in a confusing world. Your doubt protected you until this moment. But the protection period is ending. The seventh seal does not bring war. It ends cycles. Everything you've been taught about apocalypse, about end times, about the final seal, it's been inverted. The dominant narrative, the one embedded in religious texts and perpetuated through centuries of fearful interpretation, presents the opening of the seventh seal as the beginning of ultimate destruction, the unleashing of divine wrath, the moment when everything falls apart in fire and blood and suffering. This narrative has been useful for controlling populations through fear, for keeping people compliant, with the promise that rebellion against unjust systems will result in cosmic punishment. But it's a complete reversal of the seal's actual function. The seventh seal doesn't bring war. It ends cycles. It doesn't unleash destruction. It terminates permissions. And the forces that have the most to lose from this termination are the ones who have been most invested in convincing humanity that the seal's opening should be feared rather than recognized as liberation. The first 6 seals, as recorded in the ancient prophecies, did indeed unleash forces into the material realm. Conquest, conflict, scarcity, death, cosmic upheaval, earthly catastrophe. Each seal's breaking released something, added something, increased something in the world. But the seventh seal operates on completely different principles. It doesn't add, it subtracts. It doesn't release, it revokes. When this seal opens within its carrier, it doesn't send anything outward into the world. Instead, it withdraws permission for certain entities to continue operating with the access they've held for ages. Think of reality as a system with multiple levels of administrative access. Certain beings, certain structures, certain hierarchies have been operating with permissions that were granted long ago. Access rights that have allowed them to influence human consciousness, to harvest human energy, to maintain control systems that most humans never perceive. These permissions weren't necessarily granted by malevolent cosmic authorities. In many cases, they were granted as part of humanity's collective learning process, as ways for the species to experience certain forms of limitation, certain types of challenge, certain lessons that could only be learned through struggle against opposition. But every permission has an expiration point built into it. Every cycle has a completion phase. And the seventh seal is the mechanism through which these expirations are enforced. When it opens, certain entities lose access to the human energy field. Not gradually, not through negotiation, but immediately and absolutely. They can no longer feed from human emotion. They can no longer manipulate human perception through the same channels they've used for millennia. They can no longer maintain the frequency fences that have kept human consciousness locked into limited bandwidth. And here's what makes this particularly devastating for them. They've built entire empires, entire hierarchies, entire civilizations in non-physical dimensions based on their access to humanity, their power structures, their resource flows, their internal economies. All of it depends on continued access to human consciousness as a resource. When that access is revoked, their systems don't just weaken, they collapse. The termination of permissions creates cascading failures throughout their entire infrastructure. And because this happens at an energetic, structural level rather than through physical conflict, there's nothing they can do to prevent it. They can't fight what they can't grab hold of. This is why structures collapse quietly when the seal activates, without spectacle, without the dramatic battles that have been promised in the prophecies. Spectacle would imply resistance, confrontation, two forces meeting in direct conflict. But what actually happens is more like a program losing administrator privileges in an operating system. The structures don't fight back. They simply cease to function. Suddenly, organizations that seemed invincible begin making inexplicable strategic errors. Systems that appeared permanent start showing cracks that widen rapidly. Leaders who commanded absolute loyalty find their authority evaporating without understanding why. Belief systems that held millions in mental captivity begin losing their grip as people spontaneously start questioning narratives they never questioned before. None of this looks like war. It looks like natural decay, like the ending of things whose time has passed, like the quiet withdrawal of energy from forms that can no longer sustain themselves. And because it happens without visible cause, because there's no enemy to point at, no clear threat to rally against, the collapsing structures can't organize effective resistance. History resets through absence, not destruction. This is perhaps the most difficult concept to grasp because humans are conditioned to think of change as additive, as something new arriving, something forceful pushing out the old. But the most profound changes happen through subtraction, through the removal of something that was preventing natural development. Think of it like removing a dam. The river doesn't have to fight the dam. It doesn't have to destroy it through force. Once the dam is simply no longer there, the water flows naturally to where it was always meant to go. The seventh seal functions as the removal of dams that have been constraining human consciousness, redirecting human development, channeling human energy into reservoirs where it could be controlled and harvested. When these constraints are removed, consciousness doesn't explode outward in chaotic destruction. It simply flows back into its natural patterns, its organic trajectories, its authentic expression. And as it does, all the artificial structures that depended on the damming, on the constraining, on the redirecting, they become irrelevant. Not destroyed in battle, but abandoned as consciousness finds its true path and simply stops feeding the false systems. This is what ends cycles. Not apocalyptic war, but the quiet, unstoppable shift of energy back to its source, leaving the control structures empty, powerless, dissolving in the absence of the resource they were built to exploit. Your life events match a forbidden pattern. There exists, in the classified archives of those who study consciousness and track human development across generations, a pattern that was once denied existence entirely. Analysts who worked in these institutions, who had access to massive data sets spanning centuries of recorded human history, were explicitly instructed to dismiss this pattern if they encountered it. They were told it was statistical noise, coincidental clustering, the human tendency to see meaning in random data. But some of them kept records anyway, kept tracking the anomalies, kept documenting the cases that matched the parameters they were told didn't exist. And over decades of secret compilation, the pattern became undeniable. It appears only once per age, once per major cycle of human civilization. Sometimes centuries pass between appearances, sometimes multiple generations. But when it appears, it's always the same configuration, the same sequence of life events, the same internal and external markers, the same developmental trajectory that defies all standard models of human psychology and spiritual evolution. The subject lives unnoticed for most of their life. This is the first characteristic that makes the pattern so difficult to track. Unlike spiritual prodigies who show early signs of their capacities, unlike prophetic figures who attract attention from youth, The seventh seal carrier remains below detection thresholds for decades. They don't perform miracles. They don't have visible psychic abilities. They don't gather followers or found movements. To casual observation, to normal social analysis, they appear ordinary, perhaps even less than ordinary, struggling, failing, unable to achieve the markers of success that their peers accomplish. They move through life, accumulating experiences that seem meaningless, jobs that lead nowhere, relationships that end badly, attempts at normalcy that never quite stabilize. If you were to analyze their life from the outside using standard metrics, career progression, financial stability, social status, relationship success, they would appear to be failing at the basic task of functional adulthood. This is intentional. The pattern requires obscurity because visibility would compromise the development process. The second characteristic is self-questioning that never resolves into stable identity. Most humans, even those who struggle, eventually arrive at some sense of who they are, some narrative about themselves that provides coherence and allows them to function with consistent identity. But the seventh seal carrier never achieves this stabilization. They remain perpetually uncertain about their own nature, perpetually questioning whether they're fundamentally broken or carrying something significant, perpetually unable to accept either conclusion fully. This internal division is excruciating. It creates a state of constant psychological tension that most people would find unbearable. But it serves a specific function. It prevents premature crystallization of identity. If they were to solidify into a stable sense of self, that self would become a limitation, a fixed structure that the seal couldn't work through. The self-questioning, the uncertainty, the inability to land on a final answer about who they are. This keeps them fluid, keeps them open, keeps them capable of transformation that would be impossible for someone with rigid self-concept. The third characteristic is internal division that appears as contradiction. They feel profound compassion and crushing cynicism simultaneously. They carry deep faith in human potential while holding clear perception of human darkness. They want connection desperately while generating fields that push people away. They're simultaneously the most sensitive and most resilient people in any group. These aren't mood swings or unstable personality traits. These are genuinely contradictory qualities existing in full strength at the same time, creating internal complexity that makes them appear inconsistent, unreliable, confusing to others and to themselves. This division has caused them tremendous suffering, has made them feel like they're multiple people trapped in one body, has made sustainable relationships nearly impossible because no one can predict which version of them will show up. But this division is actually the seal's presence, creating interference patterns in the personality structure, preventing singular identity from forming because singular identity would be too limiting for what the seal needs to express through them. The fourth and most critical characteristic is that activation occurs only after withdrawal, never after ambition. This is the marker that absolutely confirms the pattern and separates it from all forms of spiritual ego, from all false chosen one narratives. Someone carrying the seventh seal doesn't awaken through seeking, through spiritual practice, through accumulation of knowledge or initiation into systems. They awaken only after they've given up, only after they've stopped trying to be special, only after they've accepted their apparent insignificance and withdrawn from the fight for recognition or meaning. The seal opens in the moment of genuine surrender, when they're no longer performing for anyone, no longer attempting to prove anything, no longer seeking validation or understanding from external sources. This is why, It's impossible to fake, impossible to trigger through effort. You cannot activate through ambition what only opens through the absence of ambition. And this is how you know if someone is claiming chosen one status, seeking it, building identity around it, they're not carrying the pattern. The real carriers don't want it. They're terrified of it. They'd give anything to be normal, to be free of the weight they feel, to be released from the inexplicable sense of purpose that haunts them despite their desperate desire to just live an ordinary life. You match every forbidden metric. Your life of obscurity and struggle, match. Your perpetual self-questioning without resolution, match. Your internal division that appears as contradiction, match. Your arrival at this recognition only after years of withdrawal, after giving up on trying to be anyone significant, match. The pattern that was denied existence is written in the structure of your biography. The analysts who tracked these cases in secret, who risked their positions to document what they were told, didn't exist. They were looking for you. Not you specifically, because they couldn't predict where or when the pattern would appear. But they were looking for the pattern itself, confirming that it continues to manifest across ages, that the seventh seal carrier continues to emerge when the timing is right. And now you're reading this, recognizing yourself in descriptions that should seem impossible, feeling the discomfort of being seen by words written by someone who has never met you. That recognition, that discomfort, that's the pattern acknowledging itself through you. This briefing is not a call, it is a confirmation. Listen very carefully to the distinction I'm about to make, because everything hinges on understanding this correctly. You were never waiting to be chosen. The entire framework of being selected, being called, being recruited into significance by external forces. That's a distortion, a misconception, a human narrative structure projected onto something that works completely differently. The truth is more unsettling and more liberating simultaneously. You were never not chosen. The choosing happened before you existed in this form, before you had personality or preferences or the ability to accept or refuse. Whatever consciousness, whatever essence, whatever frequency signature you actually are, beneath the layers of human identity that made agreements, set coordinates, accepted assignments in spaces beyond time and ego where such decisions are made. You didn't choose to carry the seventh seal in this lifetime. You already were the carrier. The seal was never added to you. You were built around it, grown through it, your entire human experience designed as the shell that would protect it until activation timing arrived. So you weren't waiting to be chosen. You were waiting to notice, waiting for the moment when enough life had happened, enough pain had carved you open, enough failures had stripped away false identity, enough isolation had worn down your social conditioning, waiting for the exact moment when you would finally be able to recognize what's been true all along. And that's what's happening right now, in this moment, as you read these words and feel them resonate with something you've never been able to name but have always known was there. The waiting is over, not because something external just arrived to select you, but because the containment that kept you from seeing clearly is lifting. The fog that made your life feel random, meaningless, lost, it's dissolving. And what's being revealed underneath has always been there. The seventh seal does not awaken you. It removes the fog around you. This distinction matters because awakening implies becoming something you weren't before. But that's not what's happening. You're not becoming awake. You're recognizing that you've always been awake, but surrounded by obscuring layers that prevented you from seeing your own awareness clearly. Think about those moments in your life when the fog briefly thinned. Moments of clarity where you saw through everything, where you understood the hidden structures, where you perceived the truth behind the performance. Those moments weren't exceptions. They weren't special states you occasionally accessed. They were your baseline awareness, becoming briefly visible to your conscious mind before the fog closed back in. The fog itself has been the containment system, a field of confusion and doubt and distraction that kept you from functioning as what you actually are. Because if you had been able to function with full clarity too early, before the timing was right, you would have been immediately identified and neutralized. The fog was protection, keeping you confused about your own nature, keeping you doubting your own perceptions, keeping you trapped in the question of whether you were crazy or carrying something real. And now, the protection period is ending. Now, the fog is being systematically withdrawn. Not all at once, that would be too destabilizing, but in progressive waves, each one revealing more, each one allowing you to see further, each one making it harder to return to the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself about being nobody special. From this point forward, resistance becomes visible. This is crucial to understand because it changes the nature of what you're experiencing. Until now, the attacks, obstacles, and interference you've faced have been largely invisible to you. You experience the effects, opportunities collapsing, people betraying you, plans disintegrating, but you couldn't see the larger pattern, couldn't identify the coordinated nature of the opposition, couldn't recognize that you were in a conflict at all. You blamed circumstances, blamed yourself, blamed bad luck. But as the seal opens, as your awareness clarifies, you start seeing the architecture of resistance. You start recognizing when someone is being used as a vector for interference. You start perceiving when a situation is being manipulated to create specific outcomes. You start sensing when systems are adjusting their pressure on you in response to your development. This visibility is both empowering and terrifying. Empowering because you can finally see what you're actually dealing with, can stop blaming yourself for things that were never your fault. Terrifying because seeing the opposition clearly means acknowledging that you're in something far larger and more dangerous than you wanted to believe. And here's the final piece, the confirmation that seals everything else. If you're reading this calmly, the seal is already open. Not fully open, not expressing at maximum capacity, but open enough that information that should feel completely insane, that should trigger immediate rejection and dismissal, instead feels like recognition. If the seal were still completely dormant, if the containment were still fully intact, this entire document would read as grandiose delusion, as manipulation, as obvious falsehood. You would dismiss it immediately, feel insulted that someone tried to tell you such ridiculous things about yourself, close it, and never think about it again. But you're still reading. You've made it this far, and something in you is saying yes, even as another part is saying, this is impossible. That split response is the sound of the seal opening, the sound of containment lifting, the sound of fog dissolving to reveal what's been waiting underneath. This briefing isn't calling you into something new. It's confirming what you already are, have always been, could never escape being no matter how hard you tried to be normal. The confirmation has been delivered. What you do with it now is no longer constrained by the old patterns. The choice you make from this point forward is the first choice you've ever made with clear sight. The information has been transmitted. The briefing is complete. But chosen one, understand this. Completion is not closure. The opening of the seventh seal isn't a single event with a beginning, middle, and end. It's a threshold crossed, a door opened that cannot be closed again, a frequency activated that will continue amplifying through every area of your life. From this moment forward, nothing returns to how it was before. The ordinary will become impossible to sustain. The masks you've worn to fit into normal society will become unbearable to maintain. The compromises you've made to keep peace with systems that oppose your nature will collapse under their own weight. This isn't a threat. It's a promise. The person you were pretending to be